I'm Tabitha Lord. I'm a senior writer for Book Club Babel, and I'm your host for the evening. Before I introduce our guest for tonight, I just want to take care of a couple of housekeeping items. First, you can see us, but we cannot see you if you're on the Zoom channel with us tonight. However, if you want to submit a question for Dr. Fuller to answer, you can hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen and see the little chat button. You click on that, send me a question, and I can read it on my screen and forward it along. So at any time during this evening, you're welcome to send us questions. Also, we'll be streaming on Facebook Live this evening and on YouTube. It will be posted later on our site, Book Club Babel. So tonight's guest is Dr. Randall Fuller, and I'm just going to introduce him, his credentials and his things he's written already. He is the Chapman Professor of English at the University of Tulsa. He is the author of From Battlefields Rising, How the Civil War Transformed American Literature, which won the Phi Beta Kappa Christian Gauss Award for Best Literary Criticism. And he's the author of Emerson's Ghosts, Literature, Politics, and the Making of the Americanists. He's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications, and he's received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So it is a pleasure to welcome Dr. Randall Fuller to the Author's Cut this evening. And I'm just going to read the introduction that I wrote when we did an online interview earlier, because I very rarely get so excited over nonfiction books, but this one really got me enthused. And the reason being it's fabulous to find a fresh take on something that you thought you knew a good deal about. And Darwin's theory of evolution and on the origin of the species is something I have a little bit of experience with. And Dr. Fuller presented it in such a way that it had a completely different context. And that was really exciting for me. And so that's really why I wanted to have this conversation tonight, so that I could pick his brain a little bit more. So this is what I wrote at the beginning of the post earlier, that was posted earlier. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution didn't just spark a science versus religion debate. In its day, the groundbreaking and revolutionary book On the Origin of the Species also fueled the debate over slavery in the United States. It made its way into the hands of prominent American intellectuals and influenced the thinking of transcendentalists and abolitionists alike. With The Book That Changed America, Dr. Fuller explores how one stunning idea influenced a defining moment in American history. And it's a different thing, because I think of it as the setup between the religion and science debate, when we think about evolution, but this is a completely different context. And so Dr. Fuller, let's turn it over to you. Can you tell us how you first had the seed of an idea, or where this maybe presented itself to you, that there was something interesting that you could explore with this?
Sure. And first, let me say I'm delighted to be here. I'm really happy that you invited me. I'm always interested in these things that we think we know about. I'm always interested in investigating those and trying to see if there's something that has been left out of kind of the conventional wisdom. And so I had this idea for maybe 5 years or so, that what I wanted to do was look at Darwin's theory in the United States. And initially I wanted to look at that theory as it applied to Native Americans, as when during the Indian Wars after the Civil War. I thought there might be something interesting there. And I just stumbled across a sentence in a biography of Henry David Thoreau that said that Thoreau had encountered the book in 1860, on the first day of the year of 1860. And kind of took a step back and scratched my head for a moment, because my own training had always led me to think that Darwin's theory really didn't get a foothold in American culture until after the Civil War. So that's where the germ of the idea came from, was just thinking about this really well-known transcendentalist who dies in 1862. But the fact that he encountered the book kind of got me excited. And the nice thing about working with writers like Henry David Thoreau and the others that I talk about in my book is that they were graphomaniacs. They write about everything. And so I could easily untangle the story of their encounter with the book.
That's great. So can you talk a little bit about, so I don't know how many of our viewers have actually read it, or we might be sparking their interest with our conversation tonight, but I was struck by just the number of characters that you got to meet in this book that were, names from history that I maybe knew a little bit about, or a little bit more about some. And this also framed them in a different context. Their conversation about this pre-Civil War state of affairs in the United States, and how this book, this new theory kind of impacted them. But can you just give a little character sketch on some of the main players that you researched in your book, and who they were, and sort of what their relationship was? A very sketch, because I know we could talk all night about that, because that's really
sure. And I have to say, that was really the fun part of writing the book, was getting to know a number of historical figures that I hadn't known before. Charles Darwin sends the first copy of his landmark book to the United States to a guy named Asa Gray, who's a Harvard botanist, and who reads it with complete rapt attention, writing notes in the margins of that book. He passes it on to a relative who is a child welfare reformer in New York named Charles Loring Brace, who's then invited to go to Concord, Massachusetts to give a talk on New Year's Day. And after his talk, he's invited to dinner with an abolitionist named Franklin Sanborn, Bronson Alcott, the father of Louisa May Alcott, and Henry David Thoreau. And those are the 5 people that I focus on the most in the book.
Right. Yeah, and it was just such an interesting thing how each of them had their own response to it, and they were their conversations and their worldview. It was fascinating to see. So, how much did you had you ever read The Origin of the Species before you wrote this, and what was your relationship to that particular text? I mean, although Darwin really isn't a star of this story, his text is, and obviously you became very, very familiar with it. But what was your relationship to it before you started the project?
Well, I blush to confess that I had not read it before I began the project, and I also thought I knew exactly what it was about. And what I was surprised to learn was, first of all, how beautifully written it is. Yeah. Darwin is, I think, a spectacular prose stylist who's got this argument that he wants to make and builds it with this kind of elegant set of illustrations over the course of 450 pages or so. Right. And I also was kind of delighted to learn that I didn't need an expert's vocabulary to understand Darwin's book, that with the exception of a couple of terms, I could understand his science. And so one of the things I was really interested in as I read the book over and over, actually wore out one copy of Origin of Species and then went on to a second copy. Yeah. But one of the things I was so interested in was how the literary worlds and the scientific worlds were much closer together when he was writing than they are now.
Right. I think that's such an interesting thing. I think we talked about it a little in the written interview that, back then there weren't these discrete categories of study. You did specialize, obviously, but it wasn't the way today. If you're a mathematician, you get your PhD and whatever, and you're even more specialized in that. It's a particular theory in mathematics. If you're a historian, you've got a particular time period. And these guys really had, and gals had, just such a broader, more integrated view of the world. And I think that was really interesting. And I've often lamented that we don't have that. I think it's partly why I like to be part of book clubs and things. If you're in academia, I think you get some of that because you have colleagues across the hall and that sort of thing. But in the real world now, there's a segmentation, and I think that's something's a little bit missing about our conversation, when we're that pigeonholed into it. And I think you talked a little bit about that. If you want to say any more, we talked about that in our written interview, which was your take on that was nice.
Well, I'll just say that Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is also a figure in this time period and in this locale, he was worried about that in 1841 in his great his great work, The American Scholar, he said he worries about humans becoming too fragmented and too specialized and fractured. And the American Scholar is supposed to be this person who can fuse and integrate all of these different fields. The other thing I'd quickly add about that is science was also kind of religious at this time period, because the presumption was God had created the natural world. And as a scientist studying the natural world, what you were really trying to figure out was how God had done this. So there wasn't that division between science and religion that there is often today as well.
Right. So back to the characters. I think we had talked a little bit about that. We met these characters sort of out of the context that we are used to meeting them. They're engaging with this particular book, and I didn't realize any of them had it in their hands at that time, and that was your whole premise. So was there anything surprising that you learned about any of the characters, or did you have a favorite? Just talk a little bit more about their your journey with them and what you discovered about some of them.
Yeah, I think my two favorites really were Asa Gray, the Harvard botanist, who was this incredibly energetic, world-class scientist that actually lost to history now. But he really essentially started science at Harvard in the 1830s. Was far and away the most learned person about North American botany in the world at that time. And at the same time was a born-again Christian. And so when he read Darwin's work and was initially enthused about it, and enthused because it seemed to make sense of a lot of the things that he had observed in nature, there's this kind of revelation that he goes through, but over time, slowly, he begins to realize that by accepting Darwin's theory, he is risking some of his dearly held religious belief. And so it was interesting to get to know him and to get to see how he tried to negotiate that gap between the two. My favorite character is Henry David Thoreau, and in part because, like so many other readers, for me, Thoreau had always been the author of Walden. The kind of irascible hermit who goes to the pond for 2 years and pretends to live by himself and to seek self-fulfillment and those kinds of things. What I really learned and got to know about Thoreau with this project was the Thoreau after Walden, who in many ways to me is much more interesting. He's actually social, he's gregarious, he's incredibly curious. He's teaching himself geology. He's teaching himself how to survey. He's inventing new ways to create pencils for his family. So he's just he's a real Renaissance person. And what he does after Walden is become also a world-class scientist, although one that's not formally trained. He's a person who goes out every day for 4 hours and walks around in the woods surrounding Concord, Massachusetts, and takes copious notes, and really sort of is at the vanguard of scientific knowledge as a result of that. So I think the reason I most grew to like him as I read and wrote about him in this book is because he refused to discount Darwin's theory out of hand. He too saw that much of the examples that Darwin writes about were applicable to the things that he saw, and he refused to turn away from the implications of Darwin's theory.
Yeah, it's a brave thing.
Yeah, it's intellectually courageous, right? And it's difficult for all of us to do that.
Well, I'm going to actually read a little something out of one of the books because it segues into this. it's painful when you discover, I think, for humans to grapple with these questions and to have your whole worldview sort of knocked askew. And these guys they recognized right away, most people did, and that's why I think there was such a backlash to it. They recognized that it was challenging the worldview that they held deeply, and their own spirituality, their own sense of place in the world. And I think that's something that we today still, every time we're hit with something new, it's that backlash of, holding on to the thing we thought we believed in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And I just think, so there's this, let me find it, page 188. And I think you just said it beautifully here. It said, Darwin's idea stripped life of its grandeur. They made a mockery of one's deepest certainties that the world had been wisely designed. Alcott could not imagine a universe so perversely cruel as to produce life without meaning. Nor could he bear to live in a world that was reduced to the most tangible and daily phenomena, to random change and process. And that, that's the piece of the origin of the species and the theory of evolution that I recognize is right. Challenging that sense of, our place in the world. We don't really do it so much with other sciences. We can make planes fly and we can take antibiotics, right. And we're okay with that. But when we talk about our own place in the world, it suddenly gets a little bit ugly, and we're grappling still with these deeply human questions. And I just wonder, what were you thinking when you were putting that part of the story together?
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking, and what I was interested in is how do people respond when an idea comes along that utterly upends their world. It only has happened in such stark ways. It's only happened a couple of times when Copernicus and Galileo decentered people from the universe. We're no longer are humans literally in the center on a planet that is the center of the universe, but they're becoming farther and farther away from that center. Darwin does the same thing, I think.
Right. He does.
I suspect that discussions about climate change also played into this with me, where the question of what is the relationship that humans have with the rest of the natural world, and like so many people, I don't want to think that human activity is altering the planet's climate, and yet I think we have to look at evidence. So I'd like to say that I had cast myself back into the 19th century and was only concerned with that, but I think writers are always concerned about what's going on in their own moment, and I was as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it the progress versus tradition, religion versus science, politics and agenda versus what's appropriate public policy, or we're always going to grapple with that, and we just have this resistance to yes. seeing what's in front of us. And there's always some politics involved, and there was back then. They were using on either side, we're using this theory to disprove. So you try to think about the purity of science, and even that gets kind of skewed. So can you talk a little bit about that piece in the book where the science was used to sort of make the argument for one side or the other, or both?
Yeah, and to me that was kind of the biggest revelation that I encountered. When I began to look at newspapers and magazine reviews of Darwin's book, in general, I didn't at first find concern over Darwin and established religion. The primary concern, or the primary topic that he was discussed in relationship to was race and slavery. Mm-hmm. And it's crucially important to realize that Darwin's book comes to the United States when the nation is poised on the edge of civil war. Right. It arrives about 16 months before the Civil War. The book arrives in the United States the same week that John Brown is executed for his failed raid on Harper's Ferry and an effort to foment a slave rebellion. And Darwin's book is discussed right on the same page in, the front page columns that are largely devoted to John Brown and the question of whether the North and the South will get along or will dissolve into what was called the irrepressible conflict. So how does Darwin how does he fit into this issue of slavery and race? The dominant racial thinking among scientists before Darwin's book came was by a group of scientists known as the American ethnologists. And the American ethnologists argued that every race had been created separately, that whites had been created near the Caucasus Mountains, and so were called the Caucasians, that darker skinned people had been created by God in Africa, red-skinned people in North America, and that there was a natural hierarchy. And that white people were naturally superior. God had created them to be superior, and had created black people essentially to work as laborers for whites. So that, as shocking as that theory sounds, I think to our ears now, that was considered state-of-the-art science in 1860. When Darwin's book arrives and makes a completely opposite argument. It says that since all species have evolved from one another, and if we could rewind the tape of life on Earth, what we would find is that all of the rich diversity of plants and animals would go back to common ancestors. If that's the case, many American commentators said when Darwin's book arrived, if that's the case, then black people, white people, red-skinned people are all have a shared common ancestor and are all brothers and sisters. And if that's the case, slavery is this appalling, horrific, and certainly not heavenly ordained institution that the American ethnologists said that it was.
Right. What a time to be alive. I mean, yeah. I guess we could say that about any time, but that was a definitive moment in human history, not just American history, but I think it was sort of we had to take that stand, as we have done so many times in this country with the American Revolution, really saying, no, the divine right of kings is no longer, we don't subscribe to that anymore. We're going to change the way, and now to really, and of course the idea came from somewhere else, but here it was implemented so brightly colored, and with such energy and such reverberations around the world. It's such a distinctly American way to do things. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Okay, so there's another thing I wanted to just read really quickly. On page 238. There was so many things. If you could see my copy of your book, it's highlighted and there's notes in every little corner. But
I promise not to test you on it.
No, it was really, it was such an enjoyable experience. I read it for a good bit of it on a plane, and I was just taking notes and I was writing on little cards, and I thought, I can't wait to talk to him about this. I'm so lucky that I get to talk to him about this. So this is another quote from the book, and it says, 3 years to the day after Sanborn hosted the dinner party for Charles Loring Brace, January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, effectively making official what had become increasingly apparent to most observers, that the Civil War would end not in compromise, but in the complete social transformation of whichever side lost. At this precise moment, Sanborn did what many radical abolitionists did. He turned his attention away from the issues of race and slavery. Like most New Englanders, Sanborn knew very few Black people. His abolitionist activities were made in the service of an ideal rather than on behalf of specific individuals. And that struck me. It jumped right out at me and said, when we are fighting for an ideal and there's no humanity or human face behind it, I mean, we still need those people to fight for the ideal. Obviously, this was a huge movement and they were pivotal in their activities, but I just thought that was really profound. And I wonder, you wrote those words, so you must have had some response or some kind of reaction to that.
Well, yeah. And I don't want to at all minimize the
Right.
incredible accomplishment. In 1860, the group abolitionism was, to be an abolitionist was almost to be an outlaw or a renegade. It really was a minority position. It was largely lampooned, and it was also could be dangerous. So that Henry David Thoreau, when he wants to speak out on behalf of John Brown, he goes and asks a number of his friends whether he should do it. He asks his family, because there was a real possible threat that he could be tarred and feathered if he gave a talk in the wrong place, and that sort of thing. And so they were courageous people.
Absolutely.
They were driven by a profound moral vision, but they were limited as well. And one thing, New England had very few people of color. Certainly in Concord, Massachusetts, there were graves and old houses that Thoreau writes about of slaves and former slaves, but they were almost all gone by 1860. They were not staying in New England. So there's a way in which, and Emerson was like this to a certain extent as well. There's a way in which these abolitionists had this really noble vision, but they were not hands-on. They didn't tend to associate with Black people. In fact, it turns out that even a strong abolitionist like Bronson Alcott would admit that he believed Blacks were inferior to whites, but that didn't mean they should be enslaved. That was his argument. I didn't write about this in the book, but there is this really great group of Quaker women who insisted upon linking arms with African Americans and walking to church together. And that's one of this was in Philadelphia. That's one of the really rare cases of abolitionists breaking bread with the very people that they were fighting for.
It was just an interesting thing, and I think it's still, we fight for ideals, or we try to make progress based on an ideal, and yet when I've talked to any of my friends that have served in the military and have actually been in combat, and they'll say in those moments, it's the person next to them that's who they're there to take care of and protect. It's that human person, the real person. And I just thought that was just so interesting that these guys I wouldn't have, but it makes sense that they didn't have a real experience with it, that it was based on an ideal. I just thought it was beautifully written, that piece, and it evoked something in me about the human condition, and our righteousness in a way, and then yet our disconnect sometimes from those very things that we are righteous about. Anyway.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think again that just comes from observing, I think, us. I think we're still like that.
Yeah, I agree. So you worked on this book, I read, for 4 years, give or take.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about, from a writer perspective, like to be able to dive into something for that long and to really master that material? I mean, the gratification of that, but also I'm sure there were frustrations. What was the experience like or in general, when you dig into a project like this? What's your MO?
Well, the first thing I want to do is just cast as wide a net as possible. You talk about the frustrations. That's also the frustration, because I do cast a wide net, and then it takes me a while to determine what the actual story is. Mm-hmm. I was really fortunate enough to get a Guggenheim Fellowship when I worked on this book, which gave me an entire year to read, take notes, go to archives. And so what I do first as a researcher is I go and I look at Bronson Alcott's almost illegible journals. I went and looked at Asa Gray's copy of Darwin's book and took notes on all of the little pencil marginalia. Read newspapers from the era, all of that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then I began to try to assemble it into a story. I must say that, and I think this is probably true for lots of writers, it's that it's the beginning of a project that is really, really exciting and fun. There's always a part into the project where, self-doubt and begins to happen. And that's when I move into a very pragmatic frame of mind where I say, okay, I just want to write one good page a day. And there are then some days where I tell myself just one good paragraph. Right. And I believe there was one day where I actually said just one good sentence, because I was in a really, sometimes you're in a really thorny place, but you need to have a little bit of progress every day, I think.
Right. And did you power through?
Yeah.
It's good to know that nonfiction writers, fiction writers, we all have the same struggle that like, oh my gosh, I've climbed into the mire. How am I going to get out? What is the direction out? But it must be really satisfying. I remember just, in college, just getting to my senior year in my degrees in classics. So when the archaeology and the ancient languages and the history started to really come together, and I could understand, the meaning of a word in this particular culture and that how different it was from another and how that impacted, the way I was going to translate a text. So to just dive into something and be able to have the time to really, look at those notes must be super.
It's a luxury. It's really wonderful. And from early on to realize that Henry David Thoreau, one of our truly great writers, Franklin Sanborn, the most radical abolitionist in the United States, one of the best scientists, that all of these people got together and talked about this book, that's what kept me alive and going and kind of drew me through the project.
Yeah. I think that's why I belong to book clubs because, we really don't get to do that all that often. I think in academics you do a bit, but, in real life, we don't have those intellectual conversations so much anymore. There's not a venue for that. And I think that's sort of lacking in I feel a little sad about that myself, but okay. So I want to just say that the book was also really readable. And, when you're talking about a historical period of time and there's a lot of research, often those kinds of books can be a little dry. And this one just wasn't. It really was very readable. And, you picked up on the quirky personality traits of the characters. You had tidbits of personal information. There was dramatic tension there, and it had a story arc to it, as any good book will. So is that your professor of literature coming out? I mean, how did you, I think you had to think of it in two pieces. There's the research and becoming your thesis, really. And then there's this creating a story, because it wasn't an academic paper. You published a book. So can you talk a little bit about that? How you were trying to meld those two pieces?
Yeah. And it really comes from the thing we talked about earlier, which is my worry is that with specialization comes the impossibility for us to talk to each other. And that should not be the case, I think, in the humanities, especially in the humanities. But in fact, my first book, which was a very scholarly book, not very many people read it except people interested in that very kind of, focused topic. Mm-hmm. So one of my really strong commitments is that we in the humanities need to let the culture know why what we're doing is significant. And for a literature professor, somebody who primarily teaches novels, I'd like to think that I've learned something from all those novels.
I think you have.
how to tell stories, how to create characters, because that is what, I believe that we're hardwired to learn things through narrative. Mm-hmm. So that's exactly what I did. Is I kind of start with the research, but then I think after I've done a fair amount of that, how can I tell the story in a way that a really smart undergraduate class or a book club or just general readers across the country might be provoked to pick it up and read it.
Well, I was provoked to pick it up and read it. In fact, it came on a list from, who's your publishing house? Or your publishing house? Viking. We get a list from them and they, say, if there are any of these titles that strike your fancy, and I was like, I want that one. And it didn't come for a little while. And I was like, I guess they're not going to send it. And then it showed up and I was so excited. So, it definitely, and it didn't disappoint, because I read all kinds of genres and I read some nonfiction, less so than I would like, but, I pop it in there when I can. And it really was very readable. So people out there that are looking for an intellectually challenging yet very readable, learn something new kind of a book, I suggest it strongly. So have you ever thought about writing any fiction?
Well, once upon a time I did. I actually, when I was an undergrad, I was a creative writing major. And that's where I think some of this, it's the return of the repressed, basically. Focusing on characters and storytelling has kind of come back to me. I have to be honest. I think that the difficulty always for me when I tried to write fiction as an undergrad was knowing where things ended and knowing what was going to happen. The lovely thing about writing a book that involves historical figures is sort of like what Shakespeare did with stories that had already been told. You know how it's going to end. It's all about how you're going to get it to that end.
Right. That's true. So no fiction in the near future.
Yeah, I don't see any fiction.
But you do have another project in the works.
I do.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'd be glad to, and it's completely different than the Darwin project. It's about this comparatively little known episode in Henry James's life, and I should say parenthetically, I love Henry James. He's one of my favorite American novelists. He does require effort, but his insights into the inner life seem to me to be extraordinary and vivid and rich. And there's this little known episode in his life when this wonderful novelist decides to become a playwright. He wants to conquer the stage. He wants to write a best-selling kind of light comedy or light drama. And, from my perspective, that is such manifestly a horrible idea for a writer. And that's part of what I'm interested in, is why this very self-aware novelist should want to do this thing that seems wholly out of his skill set. And he will say, well, it's because of money. I think it's other stuff that's more interesting. Mm-hmm. It's kind of in a midlife crisis. He's sequestered himself from so much of life in order to be a writer. And he's in the middle of his life, he's having a question about whether he shouldn't focus more on living, and the theater seems to represent that for him. So anyway, it's really the account of his trying to conquer the theater, at last getting a play produced by one of the premier directors in London with a cast of stars. And on opening night, which is attended by people like H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw and the Duke of Windsor, this play bombs horribly. Oh, and James is called on stage, and he's hoping to receive applause the way Oscar Wilde is across the block with The Importance of Being Earnest and other plays, and is booed. Oh. And much of the project is about the play, about the production of the play, because many of the actors wrote memoirs, and I'm kind of trying to construct that production. Uh-huh. But ultimately, this sort of horrible public humiliation led to a real refurbishing of James's career as a novelist, and he becomes a much more daring and experimental novelist after this humiliation. So that's the project I'm working on right now.
That's fascinating. Where did you Where did the seed for that one come from? Just always am curious.
Just from wondering why.
Why did he do this?
Why?
Yeah. Why on earth did he do this?
You know, why he wanted to do that when, again, the kind of like doppelganger in the book is Oscar Wilde, who is so supremely good at this. Right. And James is so kind of envious of Wilde's facility in creating plays. And also they're both gay men. And I thought that was kind of interesting that Henry James is an American who is performing Englishness, and he's a gay man who's performing straightness. And the English theater, it turns out, was kind of a haven for gay people. And so I was kind of interested in all of that.
The whole thing. That's fascinating. So are you currently teaching while you're writing this one?
I am, yes. And I just finished teaching a class on Henry James and Oscar Wilde.
That's helpful.
That was wonderful, yeah. And I had some really talented, bright grad students who helped me to see both of their works in new ways.
What do you teach, graduate and undergrads? Or
I do. I teach, and almost always in 19th century American literature, sometimes in 20th century American literature.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much. Do you have anything else that you want to add about your book for our viewers?
No, except I hope that if they read the book, they enjoy it, and by all means, they can contact me if they have any questions that they might have.
Well, I really did enjoy it, and I found it to be just, like I said, I underlined, I highlighted, and it's a great conversation, and I couldn't wait to have it with you. So thank you so much for joining us tonight on The Author's Cut.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to stop the video. Good night, everyone.